Welcome to episode 465. On today's show, we look back at how evangelicals celebrated the 4th of July. Hobby Lobby took out a controversial full-page newspaper ad featuring quotes or misquotes from America's founders about being a Christian nation, and Caitlin Chess takes issue with the ad's use of scripture. An editorial from Robert P. Jones says that the 4th of July is a time for us to decide what we believe in more, the Declaration of Independence that says all people are created equal, or the European doctrine of discovery, which enshrined white supremacy. And then David French asks, what does it really mean to be a patriot and to love our country? While the culture warriors say it's about consolidating power among Christians, French argues it's actually about surrendering power to help others. Then, Karen Swallow Pryor is back on the show to talk about a recent address she gave to the Evangelical Press Association. She says that Christian publishing is being corrupted by its addiction to celebrity authors and a lack of integrity. But who's really to blame, Christian book publishers or Christian book consumers? All of that, plus, is Spiderman and the Pope the best MCU team-up yet? But first, a quick reminder that you can interact with us about each episode by visiting holypost.com. We love reading your comments and sometimes even continuing the debates that start on the podcast with you, our faithful listeners. And for those who want to go even deeper and become true Holy Posters, you can support us through Patreon. You'll get access to bonus interviews, early access to new content like the Jesus and John Wayne series with Kristen Dumais, and a live stream every month with me, Phil, and Christian where you can interact with us and ask your questions directly. So after you listen to today's show, head over to holypost.com, share your comments about this episode, and then hit the Support Us link to learn more about becoming a patron. Okay, here is Holy Post episode 465.
Hey there, welcome back to the Holy Post podcast. This is Phil Vischer. I am here with Caitlin Chess. Hi, Caitlin.
Hi, Phil.
See, you never know what order you're going to be called in because that's just part of the way it is. And Jason Rugg. Hi, Jason.
Hey there.
You got to see Jason on YouTube because he's got Kramer hair today. Jason has Kramer hair. It's very exciting. He needs to do a dramatic entry. He comes sliding into the podcast and go, Could you do that, Jason?
I don't have a great door for it, though, because that's like the signature,
That's sad.
Yeah,
okay, Jason's in Palm Springs because he's trying to be more hot. Caitlin's in Colorado because she's outdoorsy.
I have no idea, by the way, what you're talking about with Jason's hair.
What?
What does that mean?
Kramer?
Yeah.
Have you not seen Seinfeld?
Oh, no. I mean...
Oh, here we are yet again. Yet again, the generation gap.
I am aware of what it is.
Aware of Seinfeld. Okay, Google the cast of Seinfeld and look at Kramer.
Okay.
And that's all we have to say. And Sky Jitani, who is tucked safely in his suburban home. Hi, why aren't you in Palm Springs or Colorado?
I'm actually going to be in Colorado later this week.
What?
Wow.
Are you just saying that because you want to be cool like Caitlin?
No, actually, no offense, but I didn't want to go at all. But my daughter's soccer team is now in the national championships for her league, and so we have to go to Colorado for a couple days for this tournament.
Wait, are you telling us that one of your children is a star athlete?
She is quite good, yes, at multiple sports, which comes entirely from her mother, not from me.
Wow. Okay. Well, we've learned so much today. Here's the theme song. What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Sky and Phil and the Holy Post. Sky and Phil and the Holy Post. And sometimes Caitlin. Okay. Speaking of star athletes, Pope Francis met someone 2 weeks ago. Do you know who he met?
Justin Bieber.
Very exciting. Very exciting. Oh, Caitlin, you want to venture a guess? No, not Kramer from Seinfeld, but good guess, Caitlin. Try again.
Spider-Man.
Yes, the Pope met Spider-Man, and we got photographic evidence to prove it. Pope Francis meets Spider-Man, who presents him with his mask, although he had a spare. He gave him a spare mask because obviously he couldn't take his own mask off. even in the presence of his holiness. He could not take off his mask and divulge his secret identity because no one, not even the Pope, knows who it is. It's Peter Parker, but no one knows who it is, so he can't take off his mask. The person under the mask, actually, it wasn't Peter Parker. It was Matteo Villardita. Matteo Villardita, 28-year-old. He puts on the Spider-Man costume to cheer up hospitalized children. And that day he was going to the Vatican's pediatric hospital where he was going to visit sick kids there. So that's nice. I was just a little surprised that they would let the Pope meet someone who was fully concealed in a costume with a mask.
Okay, wait a minute, though. I mean, it isn't like you can hide any weapons in that costume.
Hey, that costume is a weapon. It shoots web. It's sometimes other stuff flies out of it, depending on the version of Spider-Man.
Wait, but here's my question, though. Was this audience with the Pope pre-planned, or did he just happen to be there when the Pope was coming through visiting children also, and so the Pope meets Spider-Man, and it's one of those serendipitous moments?
That's a good question. Villardita said he asked Pope Francis to pray for the children and their families. Is that an answer? Does that answer your question?
No, I mean, it's nice. It's heartwarming.
Nice.
Or did the Pope find out, like, did somebody tell him, hey, Spider-Man's at the hospital right now, and he was like, oh, I got to get down there?
No. It was at the Pope's regular meet and greet. His weekly audience with a limited number of faithful in the San Damaso courtyard at the Vatican.
So I bet Spider-Man must have been particularly invited, like specially.
Yes, probably. But how do you know it was the right guy that showed up and not like the Tobey Maguire when he goes goth in Spider-Man 3? What if that Spider-Man showed up? That'd be terrible. And he started dancing like a weirdo. What would the Pope do then?
I think the Catholic Italian Spider-Man is a great addition to the Spider-Verse.
The Catholic. Hi, I'm your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. That works. And he'd shoot pasta out of his web sling.
Yeah, linguine, sure.
He shoots spaghetti. Linguine, shoot a spaghetti. What's a skinny spaghetti called?
It's angel hair.
Angel hair. He shoots an angel hair pasta, but it's as strong as a steel, and it wraps up on the bad guys, and it gives them something to eat that's a little starchy.
Yeah, and it spins on little forks out of his wrists.
Spins on little forks out of his wrists. This is fantastic. We've learned so much. Okay, Jason, what's the next character from the Marvel universe that the Pope should meet?
I feel like Iron Man needs the most to meet the Pope.
Iron Man? Yeah, he needs spiritual guidance. Mm-hmm. Because of the rich man and the eye of the needle, that whole problem.
More that he's dead, but yeah.
Well, we assume
Spoiler.
Then he's already met Jesus, so maybe he doesn't need to meet the Pope after all. Okay, Sky, Marvel or DC? Who should the Pope meet next?
Well, isn't there that Batman or somebody who goes around the hospitals?
Yeah. No, that was a kid who it was his wish to be Batman for a day. So they made him up as Batman, and he got to drive around in a Batmobile and stop crime.
Oh, right. Well, I thought there was a Batman that went around and visited kids also.
I'm sure there is. There is. But that's you're kind of singing the same song, just another verse. Can we get a little more creative than that?
That is true. I don't. Who would be the most Catholic of the superheroes that we know?
Why does he got to be Catholic?
Well, the Pope.
Why can't he just be
Catholic?
Someone who needs to meet the Pope. Who says that the Pope is Catholic? Okay. What about the Hulk? The Hulk is, if there's anyone could put a calm hand on the Hulk's shoulder and come. I'm sorry, Caitlin, do you know who the Hulk is?
Yes.
Okay. He's the guy. He comes flying into the room, and he's got the hair that kind of stands up on top. No, that's Kramer. Sorry. No, the Hulk, the Pope could make him. He could just he put a hand on him, and he'd turn right back into Bruce Banner. Right back. He would just calm down, and his big purple pants would fall off.
I think it's Loki. I think Loki needs to have a visit with the Pope.
Oh, yes, because of his complexity.
Yeah, and
his
he's a character in need of redemption.
Yeah, you're right. That's a good point. I like that, Sky. Okay, that's great. Caitlin, do you want to venture a comic book character?
I feel like Captain America.
Really?
That fits. Like America needs to meet the Pope.
Oh, okay. America needs to meet the Pope. But he's such a moral guy already. Does he need the Pope, or does the Pope need him? I mean, what's going on there in that dynamic? Or is he's just a doppelganger for America, a representative for America?
I feel like Captain America is more complex than we realize.
Oh.
So I feel like saying, oh, he's just moral. Like, I don't know. He does some stuff.
What about Scarlet Witch? Would they burn her at the Vatican?
Oh, dear. Don't go there, Sky. That's not a happy thought.
Or Doctor Strange?
Doctor
Strange strikes me as an atheist.
Yeah, Doctor Strange is at least a humanist. But then he meets the lady, the Tilda Swinton lady, who's all metaphysical. And now
the ancient one.
Yeah, can you believe in magic and be an atheist?
It's very Wiccan. It's very Wiccan.
That's not atheism. Wicca isn't atheism. It's just pantheism, or I don't know what it is. Okay, that's enough about that. We just came through the 4th of July. Did anyone blow anything up? Because I sure did.
No.
None of you blew anything up?
No, I didn't even go to fireworks.
Are you even Americans? Are you Americans? Jason, anything?
I have the excuse of I had to get on a plane in 4 a.m. on January, not January, July 5th. So I was trying to fall asleep and all the fireworks were going off, and it was a nightmare. So
okay,
I've got an excuse at least.
None of you are American except me.
What did you blow up?
Well, fireworks. I put on we have a family reunion in Michigan at what was my great-grandfather's farm on a lake, and I'm in charge of the fireworks. So we do a pretty good sized it's a little show, but it's, for one you do by yourself, it's loud. It's loud and not short. So it's fun. I blew up a lot of stuff, and I like that very much. Thank you. But Hobby Lobby blew something up. Did you hear about this? Jason, yeah, you did hear about this. So Hobby Lobby ran an ad on the 4th of July. You figure it's going to be a patriotic ad, right? Okay, so it's Hobby Lobby, crafts. It's 4th of July, America. So you'd think the ad would be crafts for America. Is that
yeah, but it wasn't really an ad.
No, it wasn't. Yeah. This is true. It really wasn't an ad at all. It said, "In God we trust. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord." So what would you say it was? Because it says right on the top, advertisement, advertisement, advertisement. The newspaper had to list it as an ad.
And
so
what newspaper did this run in?
Many newspapers. They bought space in many news, and they've done this for a few years, I guess.
Is it always the same content?
No, it's not always the same. Here's one story that someone wrote about it. I'm a person of faith, and Hobby Lobby's latest stunt fills me with rage. So this is a Christian. Rage.
Wow. Rage. That's a strong word.
They need to bring that to Jesus and or the Pope and or Spider-Man right away. In case you haven't been following along, Hobby Lobby is absolute trash. They've been trashed for a while, but their latest antics should have every American calling out their undemocratic, hateful BS once and for all. On July 4th, this is an opinion piece, by the way. This is not like the Associated Press giving us just the facts. On July 4th, Hobby Lobby ran a full-page ad in newspapers titled "One Nation Under God," in which it advocated for a Christian-run government. The ad included quotes from the Founding Fathers and the Bible to support its promotion of tossing out that little thing in the Bill of Rights known as separation of church and state, which of course isn't technically in the Bill of Rights, and instead invoking a Christian government. According to Newsweek, the Freedom from Religion Foundation says the company had altered the quotes without providing the full context. Did you look at the ad? Have you seen the ad? Has anyone here seen the ad?
Yep.
Yeah, so it's lots of quotes, a list of quotes from very, very early presidents, John Quincy Adams, James Madison, John Adams, George Washington, quotes from other founding fathers, Patrick Henry, Jedediah Morse. Would you say he's your favorite founding father? Jedediah Morse. And when someone's a popular founding father by, their name becoming commonplace in America. So, how many Jedediahs were in your class in fifth grade? 4, 5? Oh, okay. And Benjamin Franklin. And then quotes from Congress, quotes from Supreme Court justices, quotes of Supreme Court rulings, and quotes from a quote from Harvard in the 1636 student guidelines. Does that count as part of American history if it predates America? I'm not sure.
It counts.
In 1636, wasn't most of the faculty Native American still at Harvard? Had we taken it over from them yet?
I don't think they started it. But I mean, to their point, it is valid. It's valid American history, but it is ignoring the fact that 400 years has gone by.
Yeah. So these are all quotes that I've heard before, and you tend to hear them in the context of people saying, America is Christian. It's a Christian nation. That's what the founders wanted. And, it's also the kind of stuff that Christian historians like David Barton have pulled out for years to make those arguments that this was supposed to be a Christian nation. And if you say otherwise, you're going against the will of the founding fathers. At first, I didn't think, when people said they're advocating for theocracy or advocating that only Christians can be leaders in government, I was looking at this thinking, where did they say that? The only thing I can come up with is there's one quote, John Jay, the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and Hobby Lobby quotes him saying, Providence, how would he talk? What kind of accent would John Jay have?
Providence. A white supremacist type. Actually, I think he was against slavery. I shouldn't say that. I think he was against slavery.
Oh my goodness. So quick to throw John Jay under the bus. Haven't even read his bio. Providence has given to all people the choice of their rulers, and it is the duty, as well as the privilege and interest of our Christian nation, to select and prefer Christians for their rulers. It is our duty as Americans in a Christian nation to select Christians to be our rulers. Now, so that's something that John Jay actually said. So there's no one, saying, hey, he didn't say that. No, he said that. The question is, why would a major retailer run that quote in newspapers across the country on the 4th of July?
I'm guessing because that major retailer doesn't particularly worry about alienating non-Christians from their stores.
Really?
Right.
You really don't think they?
No. And here's the thing: like whether it's this ad or the other examples of people who pull these quotes from American history, it's a perfect example of what some have called constellational thinking. So think about when you look at the night sky and there's all these thousands, millions of stars up there, and ancients looked up at the sky and they saw these points of light and they connected the dots and they made images out of them, right? A Big Dipper, a Little Dipper, Orion, a lion, a scorpion, whatever it is. But when you do that, you have to ignore some of the points to connect others, and you create these images that are just technically they're random points of light, but you're making them into something that makes sense to you.
Right.
And people do this all the time.
You create patterns where they don't really exist.
Exactly. To provide meaning where there may not be any obvious meaning. And history is the same way. We look back at history and we pull out the points that we like and we create a pattern that didn't actually exist, but then we believe it does so strongly that we just keep reinforcing it over and over and over again. You can do the same thing with the Bible. You could make an argument from Scripture for polygamy, for example, or you could make an argument from Scripture for all kinds of terrible things, but you have to ignore a bunch of what Scripture says in order to just select out the points that affirm what you want to say. And that's exactly what they're doing with American history. And, a fuller vision of all those points, those data points of the founding fathers and that early generation would make it clear that not only were most of the people they're quoting not Christians, but many of them advocated for a pluralistic society like George Washington, who was totally in favor of Jews and Muslims and others being a part of the United States. So it's selective consolational thinking.
Leaders, surely. Not surely being leaders.
Well, of course. I mean, Jefferson was not a Christian, and Washington invited him into the cabinet as Secretary of State, and he became the third president.
He believed
Benjamin
in
Franklin was not a Christian.
They all believed in providence.
Well, believing in providence is like saying I believe in luck. It's just this amorphous idea of God that has no connection to the revelation of God in Scripture.
Okay, Caitlin, how do you think your generation reacts to things like this?
Poorly.
Does it make them want to buy more magic markers?
I do really think that like people just go to Hobby Lobby. They don't care what Hobby Lobby's doing with advertisements or what, But can I get mad about something else?
Yes. Oh, yes. Probably about what Sky said.
No, I loved what Sky said. I thought what Sky said was great.
Okay.
But the top of the ad, like visually, the like it's a bigger part than the quotes, is that Bible verse. And I am really mad about that Bible verse.
Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, Psalm 33:12.
Yes. See, I have my Bible.
So if America's God is Yahweh, then we'll be blessed.
It's a little more complicated than that. Here's why I'm mad about it. I'm mad about it not only because I think the implication of what they assume you will kind of just think those English words on face mean is wrong, but also because it plays into the thing where I pulled this verse out of context and people just assume that it means what it says it means. And so I looked it up because I knew that it was talking about Israel and not America. But I also was just curious what was around it. And I just think this is particularly comical that the verses before verse 12 are talking about the nations. So in the Old Testament, any nation that is not Israel, commonly grouped together as the nations. The verse before that says, the Lord foils the plans of the nations. He thwarts the purposes of the peoples, but the plans of the Lord stand firm forever. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. So it's like contrasting the nations in general, the nations that are not Israel, that inevitably are formed with other purposes, with sins, that are doing all their own wrong stuff. And then later down in that same chapter, it's talking about how like you can't rely on your army and your strength and your horses. And it says, but the eyes of the Lord are on those who fear him, on those who hope in is in his unfailing love, talking about individuals. And literally the ending of verse 12, they have taken the first half of verse 12, blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. The end of that verse is the people he chose for his inheritance. Like not only is it very clearly Israel, but it's talking more generally for the rest of that passage about God caring for all humanity and watching what everyone's doing. You don't need to fear because God is in control. And that feels especially ironic when so much of this like Christian nationalist kind of stuff is rooted in fear. Like our country was once good and Christian, and now we have to be really freaked out about the world our kids are going to grow up in. And we have to, have really intense measures to fix it. It's just ironic to me that the end of this psalm is basically like, look, even if you're not Israel, all people who fear God, God is watching out for you. He is sovereign. You don't have to fear. And so people should just read the whole psalm. I'm just mad that they took this one little line and the whole thing is good. And the whole thing is so opposite of the point that they're trying to make.
I didn't realize we were going to do biblical exegesis on the show today.
We should just read our Bibles is what I'm saying. We should just read the Bible.
In that part about not trusting in horses and chariots, does it say anything about craft supplies? Can I trust in craft supplies? I guess is my question.
I think craft supplies would be included in lists of things you should not trust in.
Really?
Yeah.
It's kind of ironic that Hobby Lobby's entire business model is selling people stuff to make idols with. I just think it's funny. Like it's all throughout the prophets in the Old Testament, right? You make idols out of wood and metal and ornamentation and.
Wow, I was really working on that Hobby Lobby sponsorship deal. That just flew right out the window.
I'm not saying people do make idols out of what they sell, but And I've been through that store a couple of times, and they have all their displays of like American this and Trump that, and it's very idolatrous.
Is there anything you'd like to say about Chick-fil-A now that I should know about? Anything before I try to do another?
Chick-fil-A is also quite heretical and unbiblical because their motto.
Stop it.
Their motto is that they didn't invent the chicken, just the chicken sandwich. And I think that's infringing slightly on God's territory to say that
you think God invented the chicken sandwich?
Well, I don't know. I think
you think God was the first one to put a chicken breast on 2 slices of bread?
No, I think it's a little cheeky. I think it's a little cheeky that they're using the invention of the chicken, which was clearly God's work, and they're saying, "Hey, we didn't do that." But they're not like they're using it as kind of a punchline.
We give to God what is God's, and we take for us what is us's. Which is the 2 pieces of bread with the chicken betwixt it.
Right. Well, I guess you could spin it as it's a good application of Genesis 1, where he says, have dominion over the earth and make chicken sandwiches out of the chickens.
Yeah.
Okay.
I just don't think I think God deserves a little bit more credit for the chicken sandwich.
All right. We're going to try to get Robert P. Jones on the show. He is the founder of PRRI, which is, what does that stand for? Public Religion
Research Institute.
And he wrote a piece. We're still on the 4th of July. We're doing our 4th of July wrap-up, our annual 4th of July recap. I blew stuff up. Hobby Lobby made a mess. And Robert P. Jones wrote a nice editorial. The title is, Let's Celebrate This 4th of July Without the Myth of White Christian Innocence. He says there are 2 distinct and incompatible worldviews imported to the Americas from Europe between the 15th and 19th centuries. One worldview, which was drawing on Enlightenment ideals and an egalitarian reading of the Bible that later animated the abolitionist movement, is encapsulated in the words from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. So the notion of kind of equality among all men, although we didn't practice it, and took years and years and years and years to decide that maybe women were also in that. That was a key part of our original founding narrative. But then he says there's an older competing worldview that still haunts American culture, which is known as the doctrine of discovery. It claims that European civilization and Christianity were superior to other cultures, races, and religions. And this has its roots in a series of 15th century papal bulls. There's another story that I was going to pull up, but I didn't. A Catholic priest in Syracuse is demanding that the Vatican reject these papal bulls. Have you ever been hit in the backside by a papal bull when they have the running of the papal bulls? No? Okay. The doctrine had its roots in a series of 15th century papal bulls, which merged the interests of European colonialism, including the African slave trade, with Christian missionary zeal. The most relevant of these papal bulls was issued by Pope Alexander VI in May 1493 with the express purpose of validating Spain's ownership of, quote, undiscovered lands in the Americas following the voyages of Christopher Columbus the year prior. So he says that history may seem irrelevant to us today, but in giving Europeans a divine right to seize the lands of non-Christian peoples anywhere in the world, it furnished the foundational lie that America was discovered and enshrined the innocence of settlers in the story white Christian Americans told about themselves. If Europeans were superior to all others, then enslavement and colonial conquest were merely the means of improving the temporal and eternal lot of indigenous peoples. So, looking at it that way, no actual atrocities could possibly tilt the scales of justice against these immeasurable goods.
Yeah, this is really interesting, and I mean, you can't really transport yourself back in history and put yourself in that time frame, but you can understand how it's a self-reinforcing idea, right? Because the Europeans, with their technology, sail across the ocean and they land on these other shores, and just the very nature of their technology and ability reinforces their supremacy. Because if the native peoples of North and South America were really superior to the Europeans, they'd be sailing their ships west or east and going to Europe and colonizing those lands, but it was the other way around. So the very fact that the Europeans are doing this reinforces their own belief that they are superior, which then justifies them doing this. And around you go, and it's self-reinforcing. It's a brilliantly wicked system.
And it would be easy to say, yeah, but that was in 1493. What the heck does that have to do with America today? Jones goes on to say, this attitude has chased us through American history to this day. It was formally incorporated into U.S. law in a case in 1823, which held by unanimous decision of the Supreme Court that the expulsion of Native Americans from their lands was justified by, quote, the character and religion of its inhabitants, the superior genius of Europe, and ample compensation to the Native Americans by bestowing on them civilization and Christianity in exchange for limited independence. So that was the ruling in 1823, that because we're giving them such a superior culture and such a superior religion, we are justified in taking their land.
So this is great. I mean, the argument in a nutshell is we're going to kill you, we're going to steal your land, and you should thank us for it because we're actually helping you out.
Yeah. Okay. I don't know if I just tweeted another Tyler Huckabee piece. I don't know if you saw this article in the American Conservative. It was about the indigenous kids that they've found, in mass graves at the residential facilities in Canada. And it was an argument that those were not bad. In fact, they were actually good because it showed that that the church was working to help the indigenous people come into the church, come into Christianity. And, they might have died apart from being there. They might have died if they'd stayed with their families. Lots of kids died in those days. It's a whole series of justifications for why this isn't bad, which ultimately ends up saying, even if some of them came to Christ and entered the church, it's worth the atrocities that were committed and the fact that they were taken from their parents.
That same argument's been used to justify chattel slavery.
So that was like last week. We're still using that argument to justify doing horrible things to people if it somehow gives them Christianity.
Right. Which, that's in the Gospels, sure.
Is it? Wait a minute, Caitlin. Caitlin reads the Bible. Caitlin, Sky says that's in the Gospels. Can you tell us what you found?
I am sure that Sky is not being serious because that is absurd. That's just so. Why would we have story upon story upon story of Jesus taking care of people and proclaiming the kingdom of God and freedom to the captives and sight to the blind and all of these? Like, why would that be a consistent theme throughout Scripture if we could just chuck it all in favor of just saving some individual souls and having them pray a prayer and that justifies anything that we do? It's like, I understand the people who read stuff like that and are like, how are we reading the same Bible? Like, how you clearly have been so influenced by your own ideas, by your own culture, by your own sins, so much more deeply than you have been influenced by Scripture, because you cannot get around the idea that the material conditions of people matter to God.
Yeah.
But
here's
not
the
as
part
much. Not as much as their spiritual conditions. So if push comes to shove, Caitlin, Chefs with a tiny diploma, if push comes to shove and you have to give up one, you can't give up the eternal for the temporal.
Here's the other thing about that is not just that is like a false dichotomy. That's not a decision that anywhere is made in the Gospels, but also it assumes just a ridiculous amount of knowledge by us that we do not have, that like we know how to predict how things will work out, that we know that if we, if these injustices have to happen, we know this many people will be saved. It assumes that we have an ability to make the kind of pragmatic, practical decisions that we just don't have the ability to make. So it's not, well, I can justify all these things. It's God told you to feed the hungry, to care for the vulnerable. He also told you to share the gospel. You do all of those things. You don't have to make these kinds of strategic decisions because one is greater than the other. That's the kind of perspective on history and the world and other people's hearts that you do not have because you are not God. So he tells you to do a bunch of things. You just do all of those things.
By the way, all of you who are now angry with me for insulting Caitlin's diploma, They actually sent her a tiny copy of her diploma. She tweeted it out a couple days ago. It's like 2 inches.
It's tiny.
I'm curious if was this systematic theology award like a postage stamp?
No, it was full size, and so was my real diploma. But they sent me like business card size diplomas too, so that in theological emergencies I can whip.
So
it
you
out.
can you're in the store, you're pulled over by the police. You can pull out your diploma card and then get hey, look, I'm a seminarian. But you're not a sassy seminarian, but you do have a tiny diploma.
Okay, can I piggyback on Caitlin's excellent point?
Yes, you can.
What's one of the things that's striking about the Gospels, and this is actually true of the entire Bible, is Jesus had every ability to coerce and manipulate people into following him. He had infinite power. He
could do magic tricks
exactly
all day long,
miracles, and yet there are numerous occasions where he deliberately doesn't do those things because he knows that it's going to lead to an outcome that isn't genuine, where people would follow him for the wrong reasons. And he forbids any kind of manipulation. And Paul talks about this, how they don't coerce people. They appeal to people plainly. So the very idea that we would kidnap Africans or quarantine Native Americans or take their land or force them into some kind of Christian, institutional frame or whatever, all of that is so contrary to the Gospels and to the nature of God and to the character of Christ. If anybody was going to justify that kind of evangelism, it would have been Jesus and his apostles. And yet at every turn, he refuses to operate that way. And yet through European history, the church has said, oh, it's fine. We're going to advance the gospel through the sword and through colonialism in the most abusive and inhumane ways. And it's justified because it's for the glory of God, when it's in truth the complete opposite.
So you're saying we shouldn't do that?
Yeah, basically. And I would argue there's a form, I wrote about this in my first book, but during those centuries that you quoted, those papal bulls, the primary way that power was exercised was through military force. And so the church emulated that. And I would argue today in the 21st century, power is not primarily exercised through military force, but through economic and marketplace manipulation. And ironically, the church is emulating that exact same model where we're saying, well, we're not using armies and weapons to force people to be Christians, but we are using economic power, political interest, and market manipulation to try to advance the gospel. It's exactly what the papal bulls did 400 or 500 years ago. We're doing it again. We're just using the contemporary form of power that we are biased toward. And hundreds of years from now, the church is going to look back at what was going on in the 20th and 21st century American church and be horrified at the way they tried to advance the gospel.
Oh, no. But the good news is I now have 2 ideas for fun games we can play at the first Holy Post summer picnic. Number 1 is the running of the papal bulls. Number 2 is pin the tiny diploma on Caitlin's chest.
Oh my God.
A fun game for the whole family. So we got that going for us. Jones wraps up his article by saying, today, though few would publicly affirm the troubling tenets of the doctrine of discovery, a significant number are still possessed by the spirit of white Christian innocence. In other words, whatever we did in the past, whatever my forefathers and before them did, it was for the good. It was for the good of everyone. It was for the good of the world. He says it was always the former that justified the latter. The doctrine of discovery justified the spirit of white Christian innocence. If we find white Christian supremacy indefensible, we must also relinquish the claim to innocence that it supported. It's time to exercise the ahistorical notion of white Christian supremacy and innocence. Patriotism is not the purview of those who see a white Christian America as the divinely ordained end of human achievement. We can no longer sustain its mythical vision of God and country where white Christians are always heroes, inheriting and defending America as their own divinely ordained promised land. So it's easy to hear that and say, well, I'm not doing that. I'm not doing that. Caitlin, I'm not doing that. Am I?
Well, the other thing I think about this is not only that a lot of us have a tendency to get defensive about our own history, to look back and be like, well, that feels really too heavy and too difficult and it implicates me in too many ways, so I need to get defensive about it. But the other thing I thought when reading that article was that happens on a really big scale with really huge atrocities, but it also happens in all sorts of churches with smaller things where, you telling the truth about sexual abuse in your church, that will harm the gospel. Like, people won't believe anymore because of what happened in your church. Or, if you just tell the truth about, if you try and, put some accountability or some restraints on a pastor who is, has violent outbursts or who gets angry with people or who's manipulative, he has such a great ministry, you're going to ruin his reputation. And when we have that kind of logic of like, we have the ability to stop people from becoming Christians by telling the truth about sin, not only are we doing something unbiblical by trying to cover up sin, but we're also denying the fact that God is sovereign over not only our circumstances, but those that he saves. And so for us to have any of that logic when it comes to telling the truth about our history or telling the truth about smaller things in our churches, it's just wrong.
Right. The last story in our 4th of July wrap-up is by David French. He writes, "How do Christian patriots love their country well?" And he's wrestling with some of the exact same things that Caitlin just said. He tries to define the difference between Christians patriotically pursuing power versus Christians patriotically pursuing a more just society. He says, "Remember, lest anyone think that the quest for justice, which is biblical, depends on the attainment of power. Remember this: true justice often results in the loss of authority and the empowerment of your opponents." Then he gives a couple of examples, one of which Caitlin just gave. Presciently, I forgot what word I was looking for. The pursuit of accountability and justice in the church often results in a concrete loss of power and reputation for Christian institutions. That's one reason why those who expose sin often face such brutal blowback. Don't you realize, they're told, that you're feeding into the world's attack on the church? Don't you know all the good this ministry does? Moreover, a basic commitment to legal equality means that a Christian committed to justice will defend the rights of all citizens, not just their allies. Thus, in a real way, a commitment to legal equality and free speech or in the free exercise of religion or in due process will often empower your political opponents, including people you might believe to be grievously wrong, to advocate for, defend, and live out their own fundamental values. So, and he wraps up, so here's my 4th of July proposal: counter Christian nationalists with Christian patriots. And how does the Christian patriot love his or her nation well? Through a commitment to biblical justice that quite often means we empower others more than ourselves.
Remember a couple, I don't know how many episodes ago, we talked about John MacArthur's statement about how he would not support religious freedom.
Yes.
Because it would help non-Christians.
Religious freedom.
Isn't this kind of what David French is talking about? Like, that's the idea of, I don't want to support anything that's going to help someone I disagree with. Therefore, let's throw out the Constitution. Let's throw out religious freedom. Let's throw out love your neighbor, frankly, because it might help them do something you disagree with.
Exactly. Okay. So this has been our 4th of July special. Almost 2 weeks after 4th of July. Oops, we missed. Sorry. But it was so much better because we got to read everyone's stories that they wrote for 4th of July and then comment on them. And I hope this 4th of July, now looking in the rearview mirror, that you got to blow stuff up, that you got to hopefully run with the papal bulls, maybe pin the tiny diploma on Caitlin's chest, but probably not. And that you pursued justice patriotically instead of power. Okay? All right. Sky, do we have a guest?
Yeah, we do.
That's a good one.
Yeah, I had to juggle things because of the interview that was supposed to happen didn't happen. And so, it's all in flux.
Oh, wow. Was it Caitlin's fault?
Sure.
Jason? Sure. You threw Caitlin under the bus. Oh, man.
You suggested it. I just took up your suggestion.
You were supposed to say no. It was a softball. This is easy.
Hey, you know what? If she's going to be in ministry, she needs to get used to getting blamed for things she didn't do.
Oh,
I am.
clever. All right, guys. Thanks for coming in. Thanks for listening. Thanks for supporting us on Patreon. Hopefully, you're also listening to the Jesus and John Wayne special mini series, also on this same podcast stream, which is nearing the end now, coming up on episode 4.
Yeah, it's coming out this week.
Awesome. Have a great week, and we'll talk to you next week. Bye.
I visit a lot of college campuses, or at least I did before COVID, and I engage with a lot of young people who are very animated to combat the evils that they see in the world, like racism, poverty, human trafficking, and any number of other social ills. And while I applaud their desire to make the world a better place, I'm struck by how their desire for justice is incompatible with their vision of a God who is never angry and never wrathful. If God never gets angry, then how can he really care about all the things that are broken in the world? This is what we're wrestling with right now in With God Daily. Throughout the summer, we've been doing a series about what the Bible has to say about justice, and now we're transitioning into how that fits with God's anger and wrath. Topics which are really out of favor right now in the American church, and yet are really important if we believe that this world needs to be set right from all that's wrong. If these are the kind of issues you're wrestling with and want to come to a richer, fuller, theologically deep, and biblically faithful response, then I encourage you to sign up for With God Daily, the daily devotional I write for people who hate daily devotionals. If you go to withgoddaily.com, you can learn more about how to sign up not only for the daily email, but also get the mobile app and the audio version of the devotional. We have a lot of changes coming soon to With God Daily, so now's a great time to get in and learn more about it. Again, it's at withgoddaily.com. I'm really happy to have Karen Swallow Prior back on the Holy Post. She was with us back in March in episode 448 if you want to listen to that one. But the reason she's back so soon is because she recently gave a talk to the EPA, that's the Evangelical Press Association, about what's going on, in her view, within Christian publishing. When I saw her tweeting about that talk, I knew I had to have her back on because these are really important ideas that affect me, frankly, as a writer, but affect all of us who read Christian books. While she's a big fan of Christian publishing and grateful for what the industry has done, she also recognizes that there's a shadow side that's driven by consumerism, celebrity, and frankly, sometimes just a lack of integrity. And as you'll hear from our conversation, there's some question about who's ultimately responsible for making things better, the publishers or us, the consumers. Karen Swallow Prior is Research Professor of English and Christianity and Culture at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. She's authored a bunch of books and written articles for Christianity Today, The Atlantic, The Washington Post. It actually goes on and on. She's just super well read, really thoughtful, and a great writer. I really encourage you to follow her on Twitter and social media as well because she's super engaging, funny, and really smart. Here is my conversation with Karen Swallow Prior. Karen Swallow Prior, welcome back to the Holy Post.
It's a pleasure to be on again. What did I do to deserve this?
Oh, here's what you did. You started tweeting about this talk you were going to give at the Evangelical Press Association, which caught my attention somehow. You know, people ask us all the time, how do we pick who we have on the show? And it's very, very simple. We pick people we really like who talk about ideas we think are really important. And you definitely check both those boxes. So you did this talk at the EPA. I didn't hear it, but I saw your notes and you've spoken a little bit about it on Twitter. The title is called The Great Divorce, Decoupling Christian Publishing and Celebrity Culture. Talk about a bullseye. First, give us a little background. Like, why did you speak at the EPA and why this topic?
Well, I hope my dear friend Lamar Keener isn't listening to this, so he doesn't know the backstory. He's the one, he organized the conference and invited me to speak. And of course, with COVID, this was going back a year and COVID made everything iffy and they wanted to have it in person. I said, well, I'm not going to come in person. Then they changed it online. So they had to reshuffle everything. And so, I spend all my days doing these Zoom things and I'm kind of tired of it. Sorry, guy.
No, I am too.
And so I didn't really want to do it that badly. So when he asked me, he said, if you could speak in a plenary session about any topic, what would it be? And I said, I'd talk about this. And he said, well, let me take it back and they said, they love it. And I thought these people don't want to hear about publishing less and, and being more discerning and so forth. But apparently they did. So I just thought they wouldn't like the idea. So
maybe they're in the self-flagellation. Okay. So first of all, for people who aren't aware, describe what the EPA, and it's not the Environmental Protection Agency, it's the Evangelical Press Association, but who is this? Right. Who are you talking to?
Yeah, so I'm talking mainly, and of course they probably, it's a little bit adjacent to the book publishing field, which is where this message really needs to go. But the EPA is it's an association of journalists who cover evangelical, who are from evangelical publications or cover that. And so it would include, major flagship publications like Christianity Today or blogs. And they give a number of awards each year in different categories, even including student journalist categories. I've been a judge for that. And so they really do perform a good service. I've won a couple of awards myself. Yeah. So they really do good work. And I'd spoken there before. And so it's a pretty big organization. And it was, pretty good attendance there.
Yeah. So full disclosure, when I worked at Christianity Today, obviously was a part of the EPA through that entity. Also the recipient of a number of awards, either through CT or independent of CT. So, we're not here to disparage the EPA. Obviously, they do good stuff.
I love them.
Right. But to your point, it is a collection of Christians who care about writing, who care about journalism, and who are either directly engaged or adjacent to the Christian book publishing industry.
Right.
Okay. So let's talk about this issue of Christian publishing and celebrity culture. I didn't hear your talk because I wasn't in attendance even virtually on this thing. But again, looking at your notes, why was this the topic you felt like either this was going to get you disinvited and they would stop bugging you, or you were actually going to go up and talk to them about this? Why this as the pressing issue for you?
Well, a couple of things, of course. And by the way, I do want to say I do love EPA, and I do hope I get invited back someday. I was just a little weary of the Zoom things, but it's been something I think a lot of us have who are in publishing. I publish books in the evangelical world, and I've written for some of these publications. And so it's something I pay attention to as an author. But to be honest, I pay attention to this question more as a professor who has been teaching young people, and mainly English majors, so the kind of people who want to be writers. And I get questions from them. I get questions from the outside world, from other people. And there just is this sense among so many that to be a writer is to be published, is to be a celebrity. And I find that, that there's two, we want to talk about the industry and the publishing company's responsibility for this and what it does to publishing. But for me, I'm coming at it more from what it's doing to people's souls. Because because there's this dream that I think is a false dream about if you actually do get a book published, what it's going to do for your life. Uh-huh. And then what you're willing to do without maybe even realizing it to get to that point, which is often, it can be soul crushing if it's approached in the wrong way. And of course those of us who do publish books, or in the industry. There's so many. As in all things, we should aim more for quality, not quantity. So I don't know. I just threw a whole bunch of things out there at you.
That's so un-American, Karen.
It is. Yes. The American dream is very much tied up into this, and capitalism, right? Which I love America and I love capitalism. I do. I am a capitalist. Yeah. But we need to temper these things, and we don't want to go to an extreme. And I think that's what's happened here. So,
okay. So you offer history, some context in this talk, and you give an outline of some of the background of celebrity culture within American Christianity. And I was tickled to see that you root it all the way back in George Whitefield in the 18th century. And I, as an undergraduate history student, did my sort of senior capstone paper about George Whitefield. And
wow.
So I have an affinity for that history and time frame. Talk a little bit about the history of how did we, some people think this modern contemporary Christian celebrity culture is like a new phenomenon. And I'd say it's new perhaps in its scale, but it's certainly not new in its quality, or it's always been. So talk us through a little bit of how this has developed in your mind over the centuries.
Yeah. Okay. So, I get to nerd out. Please cut me off.
Yes.
When I go too long.
Please nerd out.
When the lecture goes too long, cut me off. So, there's so much buzz about evangelicals and evangelicalism late, and people think it's just something that was invented in 2016 or maybe the 20th century, which is just not true. Evangelicalism as a movement is very much a product of modernity. And modernity came about with the Protestant Reformation, but following that, really what we call print culture, the invention of the printing press and the availability of written material, lots of written material that people could read, more people could read. And evangelicalism is the byproduct of that. It's the byproduct of people who could read, of the rise of the individual, what it meant, of social mobility. I'm packing like a lot of lectures I give in my novels class in here. And so from the beginning, evangelicalism was about kind of individualism, about social mobility, and about celebrity. Going back to George Whitefield, who was one of the founders of the evangelical movement. And it was tied to print culture in a lot of ways that I can unpack further if we have time. Just take my word for it for now. I know you are, but and so what we're seeing now is, as you said, it's not new or different, but it's exacerbated or magnified because we're seeing the same thing happen, but with digital media rather than just print culture. We have both going on, and there is something very American about it. My period is England, and it started in England, but the evangelical movement spread across the ocean and is really was a transatlantic phenomenon. But in America, we were founded on these ideals of the individual and social mobility and the American dream. And so it makes sense that publishing and creating books would be an expression of an individual and be an avenue to celebrity and maybe even riches and wealth. I don't know anything about that, but it happens for some people, I guess. And so all of this has a very long history, and I don't know if that's helpful for people to know, but it's interesting to me. So, and I think it is helpful to know.
Well, I think part of why it's helpful is part of evangelicalism has always been the utilization of mass communication tools, right? And Whitefield was the beginning of that with outdoor revivals, right? And he'd have these huge rallies and the First Great Awakening. And then print media, as you talked about, eventually radio, television, internet, social media. That's just part of the church tradition we are a part of. The byproduct of that is at least two things in my mind. One is evangelicalism hasn't really been bound together by any kind of doctrinal agreement. We have all of our differences, but what has bound us together are these sort of parachurch organizations and sinews, of which publishing is a huge part of it. And like we go to the same bookstores and we read from the same publishers, and Christianity Today and those kinds of things are really what bound this thing together. So it gives us a sense of identity and cohesion. But then secondly, it also has the byproduct of creating authority figures and that bypass very often traditional leadership structures. So, Phil and I can have a podcast here that reaches X number of people. And technically speaking, we are not under the authority of any church institution. I'm an ordained minister, so I am under the authority of an institution. But like, you can now just put out your sign and say, hey, I'm a podcaster, I'm a magazine, or I'm a writer. And perhaps millions of people may well follow you, and there's no accountability to that, really, other than what the market says.
Right.
Exactly. And that's an innovative, very American, very, capitalist, but it's kind of a new deal. It's a new thing in the history of the church. And so I think people have to have some sense of how unique we are in that regard. You didn't see that in Europe, even during the Reformation, right? There was a strong emphasis on authority structures. Okay, so what's wrong then with this? Like, what are some of the problems that you think have emerged now that we're in the 21st century and these systems have matured to a level that they have this massive influence? How is it not being wielded redemptively?
Okay. So to answer that, let me just go back and kind of fill in a picture of what you just talked about with the history, because you made a point that I think if you haven't studied that history, that period, it would be hard to picture. So I want to picture that. So in the 18th century and beforehand, and in England and throughout Europe, if you were a Christian, you went to church, you went to your church, your building, heard your pastor or priest speak every week without any choice. And so when Whitefield and John Wesley, don't forget him, went outside the church to have these open air revivals, then anyone can go and they can attract more people. They're not just limited to the number of seats in the church. And you can leave skip your church and go to this one. And so again, if you picture that by its very nature, and of course, as evangelicals, we want to spread the good news. We want to evangelize, but it has built into it this drawing people, being provocative, being, rebellious or whatever it is. There are no limits. You draw a crowd, you bring them in, and then you draw a bigger crowd. So that's, again, just thinking about having church outside and outside your parish or your place instead of inside, that's radical, right?
Yeah,
and
it
so,
was.
Yeah. So Twitter is kind of the same thing, or being a self-published author, or all of those things. You can do whatever you want and draw whoever you want, but you have to do what's going to draw them. And that's where we have to think about what the risks are and the vulnerabilities and where it's so easy to go wrong. And I do, it's something my eyes are kind of being open to of late. That there's a special vulnerability, I think, for women who perhaps don't have other forms of authority or platform that the market recognizes. And so if you're going to get a book deal because you have a certain number of Twitter followers or Instagram followers, and that's a prerequisite, then you're going to do what you need to do to get those followers. I mean, that's true of men and women, but if you're someone who already has a profession or vocation that's on the market, like me, I'm a professor, you're a minister, then you already have sort of a built-in platform. But if you don't have that built-in platform, you have to create one. And so we have to think about, what we're willing to do or shouldn't be willing to do to attract followers, to attract that, that crowd in the open air sermon. And we also have to think, and this is really more the other part of the focus of my talk is, well, think realistically about what you're going to gain from it. Because a lot of people don't realize that the average, and I haven't checked this in a while, it used to be that the average number of sales of all books published is 500.
Oh my gosh, I didn't realize it was that low.
Because there's so many. It was 2,000 for a few years, but now because self-publishing has gotten so big, 500. So,
yeah.
What are you going to get? For very few people are going to really make a name for themselves and sell a lot of books. It's like a lottery, and it's,
Okay. To your point though about attracting a crowd. Mm-hmm. And building that audience, that platform. I mean, we now have the digital tools where an individual can do that on their own. But when it comes to the EPA, when it comes to the Christian publishing world, the people who are sitting at those posts as editors, as acquisitions editors, as publishers, they kind of serve almost like ecclesiastical authority figures within evangelicalism, because they're the ones who are choosing who gets published, right? They're the gatekeepers in the way that a bishop used to be a gatekeeper in determining, well, who's qualified to enter the pulpit, who's qualified to administer communion or whatever, the ecclesiastical might be. But today it's, well, who do we allow to have our imprint and we're going to distribute to Amazon and to the Christian booksellers and all that. The concern I have is that those folks may not really recognize that that's the role they have. And they think they're making a business decision.
Yes.
When in a real sense, they're making an ecclesiastical decision about which voices ought to have a lot of influence. How do you think we're doing with that? Like, are we discerning enough about who gets that that blessing from on high?
Spoken like a true minister of the gospel. Wow, Sky. Yeah, I mean, that is a concern. And again, I think because, again, and I'm not anti-capitalist, but
right,
it is more of a capitalistic decision to make the money, to keep the doors open and keep the books coming. But this is why I'm a fan of capitalism. Even it's risky, like all freedom is risky. And the onus is on us. The onus is on us as the consumers to be discerning and I know that's asking a lot, but that's why I teach, because I want to teach people to be more discerning. But, and so, yes, I think you put it exactly right. And I can't argue with that. And maybe it is something that publishers need to think more about, but I want to talk to consumers, right? And say, we have to be discerning, and we have to stop turning to the latest, self-help or celebrity for, things that fulfill our lives. And this is why, I'm on the campaign, like, read classic literature, because that's the best self-help there is around. So, I don't know. I can't really add to what you said. I think that's really important. And I think, that's why I like that publishers, there are some Christian publishers who are very niche, they have like a brand or they have a denominational affiliation. And that's something I think to be respected and to be supported. And then, of course, we have the ones that are bought out by big publishers. And, I don't know if the distinctiveness kind of gets washed away or not. But
to quote an old bit of literature, it feels like the best of times and the worst of times. There's a lot of innovation happening out there. There's a possibility, because of digital technology, to have a niche publisher or individual voices that would never in the past have gotten an opportunity. But on the flip side, you also have these huge conglomerate companies that at the end of the day, they care about the bottom line, and that's about it. Okay. In one part of your talk here in the outline, you mention a lack of integrity and transparency. And you list a number of ways that's manifested. Unpack that. What do you see going on in the Christian publishing world that you have concern about integrity and transparency?
Well, one of my hot button issues, having been an English professor for a long, long time, is plagiarism. As a professor, of course, I see plagiarism. And of course, some of that plagiarism is unintentional because students don't really know what it is. And then a lot of it is intentional. And a lot of it is kind of in the middle, just because we don't really have a sense of intellectual property or what the difference is between, just taking something and thinking you can make it yours and so forth. But as an academic, that's something that's really important to me. And so now I go out, into the Christian publishing world, and over again, there are issues of plagiarism. And you dig into it a little bit, and most of the time it turns out, oh, well, the author didn't plagiarize, his ghostwriter did. Right?
Which is a whole nother issue.
Yes. The very first incident of plagiarism that I found at my previous university, like 20 years ago, when I called the student in, he said that he didn't plagiarize, that his father had written the paper, and his father had plagiarized. And I am not kidding you. When I called the father, he was upset with me because it wasn't for getting the son in trouble, because his son didn't do what he said. So he didn't want his son it was his fault. So he didn't want his son to get in trouble. So the dean called them both in. But anyway,
okay.
But that's just a little example of what we're talking about in, that there are layers upon layers of the lack of integrity because something else is more important. And that something else is, it doesn't even have to be sales. It can just be, well, I want to get the gospel message out there. And so I'm going to put this book out there with my name on it that I had really nothing to do, or I'm going to take this other pastor's sermon off the internet and put my name on it. And rationalizing it without understanding all the issues of integrity that are at play. So the publishing, there's just so many wrong emphases in publishing and the desire to get published that help foster these kinds of shortcuts that are easily rationalized by many.
So I take that to mean you are against ghostwriting.
This is a little controversial because I know ghostwriters and I've heard their reasons, but I'm still against it.
So obviously it's one thing to have a well-known name on the front cover of a book, but it should include, perhaps in smaller font,
saying the name with someone.
Right, exactly.
Right.
I've never understood why that's not acceptable.
Well, I haven't either, but some of the ghostwriters tell me they don't want their name
with it,
which well then maybe you shouldn't be doing that writing. So
it's not it's not the primary author who's objecting to the ghostwriter's name. It's the ghostwriter themselves doesn't want to be associated with this piece of junk they just wrote.
And again, this is so interesting because let's just say pastors do this. I don't know, but let's just say there are pastors who might tend to do this. I don't know why. What are the reasons why a pastor has to pretend to be a writer? I don't pretend to be a pastor. So, what's behind that? Why, as you said, why can it not be, big name so-and-so with so-and-so? I mean, even they don't always do this, but more often with celebrities or athletes, they will say, I mean, nobody expects, a tennis player to be a writer. So if that tennis player is telling his life story, then just, say that you've gotten help with a writer.
Yeah, I faced this to a lesser degree when I was an editor at Christianity Today. I was mostly writing for Leadership Journal, which at the time was a magazine we published for pastors and church leaders. And often we would solicit an article from some pastor about whatever topic, and he or she would send it in to us, and we're reading their raw material, and you're like, oh my goodness, this person's brilliant and thoughtful, wonderful pastor, perhaps a great preacher. They couldn't write themselves out of a paper bag. And I would have to, and others would completely rewrite the piece, keeping all of their ideas, keeping all of their, but we clean it up to the degree where it's like,
who wrote this?
Right. But our name would never appear on it, other than at the front of the magazine where we're listed as the editors. But that was sort of an editor's job. But I've never ghostwritten a book, but there's something different. Maybe I'm splitting hairs here, but it feels like there's something different when you're writing a 50,000 word book and you're doing that kind of editorial help, heavy lifting, if you will. Yeah. Okay. You mentioned buying bestsellers. I'm assuming you meant by this the tactic that has been employed for some years of purchasing books onto the bestseller list.
Yes.
Is this still going on?
Well, I haven't heard of a recent one in a few years. So basically, I do know, I think it came out with Mark Driscoll a few years ago, the last one. I also know that there was a well-known pastor who came to speak at my previous institution, and the book was handed out supposedly free to the students at a 10,000 member convocation with 10,000 students, and then they got billed for it on their tuition bill.
Wow.
And they were not happy about it, and so that happened. And then I've seen a few at least one recent publication climb really fast to the top of the Amazon bestseller list, like really fast. And I was like, like someone who's not really, I don't think that well known. But anyway, so I think there are probably all kinds of ways to game the system. I don't know them other than those things that have come up in a few news articles. And it's just, I mean, not only is it wrong, it's just sad. It still goes back to what is it we're really trying to say or do? This is not about the gospel. This is not about, I don't know what it's about. It has to be about empire building and institutional aggrandizement or ego building. I don't know, but I think we're all of us, no matter where we're involved in the publishing system, whether we're the ones publishing the books or buying the books or reading the books or reviewing the books. I just think we need to really, there's so many books, so many. So we need to think about which ones we want to pay attention to and support and read, because it's so much more than just a book.
Well, okay, to go back a little bit to your point of you want to create more discerning consumers, right? Who make better decisions about what they purchase and do. A consumer can only be as discerning as the market is transparent. Right. So, I mean, that's where the dilemma, I think, comes in, is the average Christian consumer has no idea who's bought themselves onto the bestseller list. They didn't know that book was ghostwritten. How would they? They don't realize that chapter was plagiarized from someone, because they just don't have the tools to see that. So on some level, yes, we need to be discerning as consumers, but this does then put the onus on the publishers.
Yes.
On those elements to say, no, we're not going to publish these ideas because they're not orthodox or they're stolen from somebody so that's where I still have a bone to pick with some of the insiders who are profiting on this system that the average consumer couldn't do nothing about because they have no idea what's happening behind the curtain. So what do we do about that element of it?
I think when we maybe, and this is something maybe that I can do. I haven't really thought about it. It's a good question. Like when something like that is revealed or shown to be the case, I mean, I've seen publishers pull something off the shelf, not often, but pull something off the shelf or make a change or disclaimer or something. And so maybe there is pressure to be born in that area when these are revealed. And certainly, in the editorial process, just making, in universities, we have plagiarism software. I have heard of some publishers using them. But no, even knowing your writers enough to know what, whether it's them or if you're taking on a writer that's less experienced, knowing that, I once there are a lot of books I don't endorse. There are a lot that I do. But at one point I turned down an endorsement request because I was pretty sure that the writer had far too much help. I could just tell. And for a couple of reasons. And so I just said, I'm not going to endorse that book. So there are lots of entry points into that maybe wherever we are in the process of publishing and consuming a book, there's probably more weight that we can put to bear on these questions. But certainly the publishers can, but certainly we can ask them to and be more insistent and use our influence to help that happen.
Okay, last question, at least for this. Speak to the average audience member who's listening to this right now, who is perusing Amazon or maybe actually goes to a physical bookstore once in a while and looks at books. I'm going to hedge you in a little bit here. Apart from reading those wonderful classics, the super texts that have stood the test of time, that have something inherently honest about the human condition that we need to be formed by. Apart from that, which we know you're an advocate for, how do you advise people to go in and purchase a book or think about what they're going to spend 5 or 10 hours reading that might be formative for their Christian life or just life in general? What advice do you give your students or others who come to you as a well-read, thoughtful person?
Well, I don't know if anyone's ever really asked me this question this way. It's a good question. So I think what I want to say, because I'm someone who I know what I need to read and want to read, and it's easy for me. I don't know that I have people asking, I mean, they'll ask me what I think they should read. And I'm like, you're not going to like what I read. So, but here's what I want to say is I want to go back to quality over quantity. So meaning pick good books. And now I know that that's begging the question, but put more into them, choose more challenging books. And here's the thing that I think can help is book clubs or discussions, like read with other people to talk about a book, or even to choose a book. I think those are wonderful ways to even to select a book within a small Facebook group or a group of local friends or in a church, so that you're actually being guided and in part of accountable to a friendly community, even in choosing a book. And I'm not saying every single thing that you read, but the things that you really invest in, that will help develop you as a reader and a thinker. I've participated. I mean, I don't have a lot of time. I'm reading books all the time, but I've actually recently participated in a couple of online Zoom meeting discussions about some controversial books that with my friends that like, well, you just have to read this and talk about it. Like that's actually helped. I'm a good reader. I'm skilled, but I still wanted help and guidance and insights from other people who were reading this book so that we could talk about it together. And that's very formative, I think, and can help. So look to other people, get their feedback, and in selecting a book and reading a book, and choose better quality books that maybe take more time, and abandon the whole, I'm going to read this many number of books a year or whatever, and just choose quality over quantity.
Yeah. At some point here in your notes, you talked about how celebrity is not the same as credibility.
Yes.
And it's so easy to just say, well, this is the best-selling book, or this is what everyone throughout Christendom is talking about right now. And it's easy to get caught up in the hype.
Right.
And it's a little different if you have a good network, a good community of friends, people who you trust both relationally and spiritually, and ask them what's been really helpful, informative for you.
Yes.
It's a better way to pick a book than just looking at some marketing nonsense that's come over the transom from evangelicalism.
And that's what, just social media can do that. Like you can just put a question out on social media and ask the question in such a way, like what, as you just did, what's a book that was really formative and had left a lasting impression with you, and ask for input that way very easily. And you're going to get different feedback than just, as you said, just get it going with the bestseller. Great.
Well, Karen, thank you so much for your time today. Is there something you want people to go to, a website, your social media, Twitter feed, your new podcast, something we can direct them to before we go?
Well, probably the easiest place to get the snapshot is my website, karenswallapryor.com. I'm on Twitter too, KS Pryor, and that's I don't recommend anyone go on Twitter, but if you want to. But you can see my books.
Do as I say, not as I do. Is that kind of?
Yes, exactly.
Would you be willing to stick around for a few minutes to just record a short bonus segment for our Patreon folks?
Absolutely.
Okay. And thank you for being generous with your time. Thanks for your wisdom on all of this. As obviously a writer and someone who cares about the written word, we need more voices like yours directing us towards wisdom and discernment. So thank you so much for that.
You're very welcome.
The Holy Post Podcast is a production of Phil Vischer Enterprises, that's Phil's company, and Sky Pilot Media, that's Sky's company. Production assistance by Julie Betcher. Editing by Jason Rugg. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by supporting us at patreon.com/Holy Post. Also, be sure to leave a review on iTunes so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary plus ukulele and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, and more.